Hello, Adeline. Today I'm going to read The Littles by John Peterson. I think I was telling you the other day that the littles are little people that live in a big house. And they have tails and pointed ears, which you can sort of see in this picture. You can see the pointed ears, and there's her tail right there. All right, Chapter 1. William T. Little and his family were tiny people. They lived in a house owned by George W. Big. Mr. Big and his family didn't know the Littles were living with them. The Littles kept out of sight. They lived in tiny rooms in the walls of the house. The Littles looked almost like people you see every day, but they were very much smaller. Mr. Little was only 6 inches tall, and he was big for a little. The other Littles were even smaller. In one way, the Littles did not look at all like other people. They had tails. The Littles were proud of their tails. They kept them combed and brushed, and sometimes the women curled their tails when they wanted to look especially nice. The Littles took everything they needed from the Bigs. Usually the Bigs didn't even know anything was missing. But once in a while, Mrs. Big would say, "Now where did that thing go? I had it right here a minute ago. It seems to have disappeared." Only last week her son Henry had shouted, "Hey, Ma! Where are my red socks? I can't find them anywhere." And of course, the Littles got all their food from the Bigs. When the Bigs had roast beef for dinner, the Littles had roast beef for dinner too. The Bigs didn't know it, but the electric socket on the kitchen counter was a secret door. As soon as the Big family were busy eating their cake or pie or jello, the Littles would dash through the door. They would take what they needed of the leftover dinner scraps and be back through the door in seconds. The Littles helped the Bigs in return for the things they took. Only the Bigs didn't know it. For one thing, the Littles were good at fixing things. They ran back and forth inside the walls, repairing the electric wires whenever they needed it. The Littles were good plumbers, too. On cold winter days, they kept the outside water pipes from freezing. Often they had to stay up all night, keeping the pipes warm by candlelight. Mr. Big could never understand why his plumbing and electricity worked so well. "I can't believe it," he would say. "I have less trouble with this old house than my neighbors do with their brand new houses." He would shake his head. "I guess they don't make houses the way they used to." End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Well, you know what? First, let me show you the picture of the Littles. Here's the family of Littles. And here's the Littles helping themselves to some food. All right, Chapter 2. One day in May, the Littles were together in their living room. The two children, Tom, 10 years old, and Lucy, 8, were on the sofa next to their mother. Granny Little sat in her rocking chair knitting a red sweater for Tom. "Don't know why Henry Big made such a fuss when we took his old red socks," she said. "One of them had a real bad hole in the toe." Uncle Pete, holding his cane, leaned against the fireplace. "You have enough red yarn there, Granny," he said, "to start a knitting factory." Mr. Little was walking back and forth. "Please sit down, Will," said Mrs. Little. "You're making me nervous." "Now there's no reason for us to be worried," said Mr. Little. "The Bigs have gone on vacation before." "But never for 3 months," said Mrs. Little. "And what about this new family?" said Uncle Pete. "The Newcombs." He shook his cane in the air. "We don't even know them." "We don't have to, Uncle Pete. I keep telling you that," said Mr. Little. If you're good enough If they're good enough for the bigs, they're good enough for the littles. Besides, they'll only be here for 3 months. We can stand anything for 3 months." "Why do they want to rent the house for only 3 months?" said Tom. "Isn't that kind of silly?" "The Newcombs are from the city," said Mr. Little. "Sometimes city people rent houses in the country while owners are away on vacation." "It's like a vacation for city people to live in the country for a while," said Mrs. Little. "I don't like it," said Uncle Pete. "Suppose they bring a cat with them." Lucy Little moved closer to her mother. "Oh, Mother, suppose they bring a cat with them." Mrs. Little put her arm around her daughter. Granny Little stopped rocking. "Did he say they have a cat?" She nodded towards Uncle Pete. "No, no," said Mr. Little. "He said suppose they have a cat." "Oh," said Granny Little. She started rocking again. "I hope they don't bring a cat." "Aw, who's afraid of an old cat?" said Tom. "I wish everybody would stop talking about cats," said Lucy. "I'm afraid of cats." She looked from person to person. "Please, let's stop talking about cats." End of chapter 2. Let me show you a picture of Granny knitting with the pair of red socks. Chapter 3. There was a secret lookout place behind the light switch in the hall of the Biggs house. One of the screws was missing. The empty hole was large enough for a Little to look and listen through. Mr. Little spent all the next day at the lookout place. Tom Little stayed with him. They were waiting for the Newcombs. "When they come, be careful of that light switch, Tom," said Mr. Little. "Likely as not, the first thing they'll do is turn on the hall light." Sometime in the late afternoon, Mr. Little thought he heard a noise. He looked through the hole. "Are they coming?" said Tom. "Not yet. Hold it." Mr. Little heard a key in the front door. "Yes, here they come now. Shh." "Where's the hall light, Charlie?" It was a woman's voice. "I have it," said Charles Newcomb. There were sparks inside the lookout place as the light was turned on. Tom Little jumped. His father turned from the peephole and put his finger to his lips. Shh. The bright light from the hall came through the peephole into their dark hiding place. Tom could see his father's face clearly. Mr. Little returned to the hole. "What a drive," said Mrs. Newcomb. She sat down heavily on the suitcase. "Give me a minute to rest, and I'll help you with the rest of the bags." "No need to help, Mrs. N," said Mr. Newcomb. "I'll get the bags myself. No tipping, please. It's part of the service here at the Biggs Summer Hotel." Mrs. Newcomb laughed. "Where do you get the energy?" she said. "From the country," said Mr. Newcomb. "I didn't realize how much I'd missed it. I get energy from just looking at all the trees and space. We're going to be here 3 months. Think of it." "I am," said Mrs. Newcomb. "I'll still have to get 3 meals a day, only now it'll be in a strange kitchen." "Listen, Liz," said Mr. Newcomb. "You've come here to write, and I've come here to paint. Nothing else is important." Sure, Mrs. Newcomb laughed. "Tell me that after eating hamburger for a week." "I mean it, Liz," said Mr. Newcomb. "Forget about housework. Write those stories you want to write. As for me," he twirled around and did a little dance. "This isn't my house. If the faucets drip, let 'em drip. I may not even take out the garbage." "You really mean it, don't you?" said Mrs. Newcomb. "Sure I do," said Mr. Newcomb. "I'm here to paint masterpieces, and that's what I'm going to do. And when I'm not doing that, I'm going to do nothing. I'll loaf, sit in the sun and eat." He laughed. "Hamburgers, of course." End of chapter 3. Now let me show you Mr. Little looking through the light socket to see if he can see the Newcombs coming to visit. And then there's Tom holding the ladder to make sure his dad doesn't fall. Chapter 4. A week had passed. Uncle Pete thought it was a bad beginning. It looks as though Newcomb means what he says. The place is a mess since they came. He pushed his plate away and threw down his napkin. And I am getting tired of hamburger. No matter, said Mr. Little. It'll be over one day, and the Biggs will return. No harm done. Something bad will come of it, you'll see, Uncle Pete said. Well, at least they don't have a cat, said Lucy Little. That's right, said Mrs. Little. She smiled at her family. Lucy is looking on the bright side. Things could be worse. Bah, said Uncle Pete. Right now I'd rather have trouble with a cat than eat this cooking. Here's the family having dinner. Hamburger for a gazillionth time. I suppose I should have learned to cook, said Mrs. Little. She looked around the table. Mrs. Big was such a good cook it didn't seem necessary for me to cook too. I guess she spoiled us. All the Littles nodded. Suddenly Granny Little spoke. Watch out for mice. Why do you say that, Granny? Said Mr. Little. There are no mice in this house. George Big wouldn't stand for it. Granny Little looked sharply at Mr. Little. There will be mice, she said. Then she straightened the shawl on her shoulders. Don't worry, Granny, said Mr. Little. You're thinking of the old days. This is nothing like the old days. End of chapter 4. Okay, I think that's good for this time. And I think 4 chapters is a nice amount. Seems to be about 12-ish minutes. I don't really have any great news that I wanted to share today. It is windy here, but it always is. I hope you're doing well. It is now going to be 9 days when I see you. And then I will probably bring a couple books to read with you. Or maybe I'll read some of the books you already have. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll keep reading The Littles. Bye for now.